Hey everybody, this is Scott. Thought I would record another Ember tutorial. It's been a little bit since I've done one, unfortunately a little over a month, but I really wanted to cover probably one of my favorite subjects within Ember, and that's services. So Ember services is something I found kind of confusing, especially when I first started, but once you get an understanding of it, you kind of realize what services it can do for you, and you end up kind of using them maybe probably more than you should. But they're really awesome and they can do a lot. So if you go to the Ember Guides website, it describes an Ember service as an Ember object that lives for the duration of the application and can be made available in different parts of your application. So what does that really mean? So if you think of something like a component, right? A component is stateless. I can put a component anywhere on a template and I can have as many of those components as I want. Whereas a service, like controllers, a service is a singleton. There's only one instance of a service. So if I create a service called foo, I can only have one instance of that service. And the nice thing about that is it gives it long-lived state over the application, and I can inject that service anywhere that I want. So I can actually access that service within routes, within controllers, within models, within components, and they're all accessing the same thing. So one of the examples that the Ember Guides website, and actually a lot of websites give of a service, is a shopping cart. And it's actually a really good example because it makes sense. Everyone knows how a shopping cart works, right? If I add an item to my shopping cart, I expect that item to be there. It doesn't matter if I go to the Contact Us page or their blog, or if I start looking at different items. I expect my shopping cart to be the same. There's one instance of my shopping cart on this application. And that's exactly what services can do. So sometimes it can be kind of hard to think, when should I use a service and when shouldn't I use a service? So I was going to go over a couple of examples. Since shopping cart is kind of the most obvious example, I'm going to skip it because there's so many guides out there. If you're looking to build a shopping cart, I would follow maybe the one on the Ember Guides. There's Dockyard has a nice Ember cart add-on that you can use. And honestly, if you're looking to do a shopping cart, there's probably some sort of service that you can purchase, or some add-on that you can use. So once again, I'm going to use the Super Rentals repository. It's part of the Ember Learn. It's one of those repositories, so you can pull this right from GitHub if you want and want to follow along. So here we just have the basic route right now of the rentals. It just shows some rentals, but I'm just going to stub out a bunch of stuff so we can kind of see what we can do. So let's just go over a really basic example. We'll Ember generate a service and we'll call it foobar. So it throws it in the services folder and automatically adds our unit test for us. So let's hop into our code and see what that added. Services foobar. Cool. Extends from Ember service just like anything else. So what I want to do is I just want to set a property on this, and I want to show you that that property is going to be the same no matter where I go. So let's just call it property. By default, it'll be nil. And then maybe we have some sort of set property call, and that can be, this dot set property to thing. I'm not very good at naming. Right, we'll pass it in something and we will set it, and maybe we have a get property as well. Oops. And we'll return this dot get property, right? Really, really simple service. So let's go into our this route right here, and we're going to add a button to this page. So let's find this. Where this lives. Cool. It's right in the rentals template. So here's a basic link to. Let's add another one. Actually, I'm going to make this just a regular button. Button with a class of button. And we'll call it add thing. All right. Let's see how that looks. There's some weird spacing, but whatever. So how do I access this service? like I said, you can actually access services anywhere. It could be within a route, in a controller. So in this instance, I'm going to actually access this on the, actually I want to access it on the route. So here is the rentals route. And in order to access a service, you have to inject it. So if we call it foobar, we can call ember.inject service foobar. So inject service expects the name of the service that you're injecting. So if we save this, we should hopefully not get a failure. We get failures for other reasons, but that's fine. And then let's add an action to this. And we'll call it set the thing. Why not? So foobar, the service, is now a property on my route object. So if we want to access this, we have to get foobar. So let foobar equals ember.get this foobar. So get the property called foobar on this, which is my route object. So it's going to get this because this function by default won't have access to this, so we have to explicitly fetch it. So now that we have that, we can then do foobar dot set property, and we'll just pass in a string called monkey. So now that we have this object that we injected here, we can call the functions that we set on it. So set property, and accepts really whatever we want to pass to it, and we can do that here. So now we want to actually add this action to that button. So we can do that with this action, set the thing. And just to be clear that we're doing it, let's add like a console log. We are setting the thing. Cool. We are setting the thing. We hit that function properly. Awesome. So on this page, I want to actually render the thing that we're setting, right? So where can we add things to the page? Well, that's usually done in controllers, right? So in the rentals route, we have a index sub route. That's actually what lists all these rentals off. So I'm going to add a header here. And we're going to fill this in just a second. But let's save this just so we can know where we're going to be looking. So the thing is, and then I'm going to list the thing right here. So how do we get this on the page? Well, controllers are in charge of communicating our data to our view. So we want to go to our controllers, and in this case we're on the index route of the rentals route. So index is the sub route of rentals, and we're going to render that here. So just like we did in the route file, we're going to inject our foobar service. So foobar ember.inject service foobar. Cool. So now we have this property there. So if I want to render something on this, I could actually just render it as foobar dot what do we call it? Property. Let's do that. I should be able to just do foobar dot property. It's going to be nil by default, and then if I do add the thing, there, we got monkey added to it. So what happened here, right? We injected the service into our route object, right? Because we can inject services anywhere. Our route object, this is the parent route for the rentals route. Rentals has a sub route of index, which is, you know, what it renders in its outlet by default. So this is where our sub route is rendered. And then on a completely different object, so in this case the controller object, which is not set up by this particular route, I also injected that service, and then it had access to the same exact properties that I set. So this is really what services do, right? I can do something on a service, I can store a value there, and no matter where I go and what I do, as long as the app isn't destroyed, I have access to those properties anywhere. So again, like the idea of a shopping cart, I add something to my shopping cart, I can then access those items elsewhere. It has long-lived state over my application. Cool. So you might be wondering, if you've ever looked into controllers, you might be thinking that, hey, this is kind of similar to what controllers do. Controllers are also singletons. There's only one instance of them. Why don't I do this logic in a controller? And you kind of can. You actually can inject controllers. So if there was another, if I wanted to inject like the rentals show controller, like let's generate that real quick. Ember generate controller, rentals/show. The show route, of course, being if I actually click on a particular rental, I can view more details on that. It is showing me something about that rental. But if I wanted to inject that, I could call it, show controller, ember.inject controller, rentals/show. And just to make sure I wrote that right, Ember should crash if I miswrite it. Cool. So you can inject controllers like you inject services. The only downside is you can only inject controllers into other controllers. So I can't inject a controller into a component. I couldn't inject the controller into this route because it's a route object. It's a completely different class. So if you're wondering when should I inject controllers versus services, typically I would only inject a controller if I need to access a property on like a child controller. Like if I set a property on the rentals controller, the parent of all these routes, and I wanted to access a property on it, it might make sense to inject that controller to its child controller to access those properties. So in layman's terms, when would I inject a controller versus a service? If you only need to access properties on a particular route, I would go with a controller. If you want to access properties essentially anywhere, either on a component, routes, models, go with the service, because the service is going to live anywhere. Controllers are only going to be accessed by other controllers. So if it's something like I just have this page and it has some subroutes, but I want this property to be accessible by all the subroutes, maybe go with the controller. But when in doubt, go with the service, because the service is always going to work. A controller is just sometimes going to work. And that's a big reason actually why, if you read the Ember blogs and posts, people are saying, controllers are going away. And services is a big reason for that. So controllers aren't necessarily going away, but the thing with a controller is that it kind of does two things. A controller renders our data, communicates our model to our view, and then it has long-lived state, and it's a singleton, right? So the problem kind of developers were running into is that they had these controllers that were huge. It communicates our model to our view. Well, that's actually something components can do decently well, right? We can pass information to our component. It can manipulate that data and make it accessible, clean it up for our view. And controllers have long-lived state. Well, controller or services do that, right? So you had these huge files that were doing multiple things. Why should I have one file that controls my state and communicates data to the view? It didn't really make sense. So they want to separate out those concerns. That's where routable components are going to come in. You're going to see a lot of the logic that lives in controllers move to that, and a lot of this long-lived state logic that lives in controllers now should move to services. So it's not that controllers are going away. You'll still have use cases for them, but it's more about leaning towards these things that are frankly just better at the two things that controllers really did for us. I hope that kind of makes sense. So one quick little note, little shorthand. If the property here matches the name of the service, you actually don't have to pass in the name of the service. You just do a camel-cased version of your service, and it should still work. So a little shorthand there. So again, because my service is called foo-bar, Ember is going to assume it's something like that, but if I put in a bunch of random characters, you'll see it'll actually fail because it can't find it. Unknown service foo-bar. And you know that me, I like the shorthand of stuff, so we can destructure Ember here, because I hate having to write ember.inject.service. I can do inject service equals Ember, and then I can write it like that, and look at that, still works. And then we can also destructure controller as well, make it a little more readable for us. If you're not familiar with this syntax, check out some of my other videos. I pretty much discuss it in every single video I do. I just like doing this because I think it makes the actual class itself easier to read. Foobar, what is foobar? Oh, it's a service. Cool. If I want to investigate foobar, I can go look into that. Awesome. So that's really kind of the basic intro to services. So one really cool example that I wanted to go out to explain out is that we can use services for more than just like setting properties. We can actually store things like functions and actions within them. And one of the things that I've had to do in a few applications is defer a transition. So one of the problems a lot of people have to solve is authentication. I've gotten a lot of comments about tutorials on authentication, and frankly it's a really big subject because it's kind of a full stack subject, and I try to focus these videos more on the front end, which is Ember. But we can kind of stub some things out and kind of go over how we can handle this. So let's create a new service really quick. Ember generate service, and we'll call it session. Cool. So let's go to our service called session, and let's destructure again because I like doing that. Equals Ember, right? Then we can delete this. So we're going to have a property here called authenticated. By default, it's going to be false because the user, when they come to our application, they're not logged in, they're not authenticated. Then we're going to have a login action. And normally this would be, you know, waiting on a response from your API. Typically you get a cookie back from your API, some sort of session cookie. We use that for authentication, and that way we can keep the session alive. I would recommend reading up on this. I'm certainly not an expert on it. We use Tori, which kind of makes some of this stuff very easy for us in our applications. But for now, we're just going to stub this out. We're going to ember.set this authenticated to true. And we'll add a logout. Ember.set this authenticated to false. Cool. And we can destructure this as well. Grab that and that. Look at that. Really, really simple. Then we also want to have a function that can check to see if the person is authenticated. Now, much like we did up here, I could directly access the properties on my session. I usually like to have setters and getters though. Is authenticated, return get this authenticated. So then we have to pull in get from Ember. So this is ember.get. Yeah, you don't typically want to have some class manipulating properties or accessing properties directly on another class or another object. It's kind of brittle that way. So let's have these functions that, you know, do expose these, but ultimately they're going to be in charge of it. So we can set it to true or set it to false and check to see whether the person is authenticated. Awesome. So let's go back to our rentals route. Let's get rid of this, and we'll call this session, and we will do some destructuring because I love doing that. Inject service. We also had get, and I think that's pretty good. So then we can delete that. Session is a service. Let's get rid of this action because we don't need it right now. So we'll save that. Then we'll come here and we're going to make this, I'm going to delete this just so it looks a little bit better. This will be our login button. Login user. Oops. And this will be the name of the action that we're going to create. So login user. going to be this action here. We're going to get this session. So get this, which refers to our route object, session, which refers to the service we just created. And then we can call, oops, let's close some of these windows, we can call the login function directly. Cool. Before I would have assigned like session to a variable, but we can just do it very easily right here. So we'll save that, and let's just make sure our app loads. It didn't though, because I probably wrote something wrong because I missed a comma, and Ember hated that. There we go. So there's my login button. So now we are going to render whether the person is logged in or not. So let's kind of do what we were doing before. So let's get rid of this, and we will inject our session service into this controller. So again, I want to render something on the page conditionally. So my template has to have access to a property that has to live on my controller. So now we have this here, and I'm going to write something like, you are logged in, and we're only going to render that if session.isAuthenticated. So here we go, we load our page. By default, we are apparently logged in. So that's interesting. What does login do? Alright, so rather than an alias, let's write it out as computed. That is authenticated equal get this session dot, and then we'll call is authenticated. So now we need to import get from Ember, and we will return is authenticated, and while we're here we will also log it. False, false. Okay, so it didn't seem to like that I was directly calling the function here. I guess that kind of makes sense. So a computed property might take care of that for us. So assumedly, if I log in, then we see it. Awesome. So maybe we can add a logout button that kills that session for us. But for now, let's kind of work off this really simple example. So we have a way of logging a user in as long as our app's not destroyed. They're going to stay logged in, because again, if I refresh this app, as you'll see, it's going to log the user out because the service is going to destroy itself. And that's why you would typically have some sort of cookie actually that sets the authentication. That way, if we refresh the page, that cookie is still there. We can still keep the person logged in. So one of the things that when you have authentication, you presumably have certain routes on your app that you actually don't want the person to access unless they're logged in, right? So let's create an app like that. Maybe it's, or excuse me, a route. So Ember generate route, let's call it like profile, right? You can't edit your profile unless you're logged in, because otherwise how would we know who you are? So within our template, our nav bar, and I'm not sure where that is stored. Let's look this up. In our application, yep. So maybe let's add one more link to here. That goes to profile. This will say profile. And we'll load this up, and we'll add some big headers here. You are on the profile page. And maybe we'll do a paragraph here. You should only see this route if you are logged in. Oops. Cool. We'll save it. We'll go here. Okay. So obviously by default, it doesn't know to check to see if the person is logged in or not. So how can we make it do this? So typically within your application, you want to be able to differentiate between routes that require authentication and routes that do not. And you can do this a number of different ways. I find the easiest way to do it is to create a route class called Authenticated Route, and all authenticated routes can extend from that. So let's go look at our routes files here. Right now we just have a route per page, essentially, right? Per route, which I'm saying route a lot, so it sounds super confusing. So I'm just going to duplicate one of these because I don't want to render it through, I don't want to generate it through Ember-CLI because I don't actually want a template. I just want a base class for authenticated. So this is my authenticated route class. So what is this going to do? Well, it's going to check our service. Is the person logged in? If so, I'm going to redirect them. Or excuse me, if so, they can access this page. If not, I'm actually going to redirect them and force them to log in. So let's destructure some stuff. We know we're going to need our service, so we're going to inject that service. Equals Ember. So we're within the route class, and route class has a few different hooks that we can hook into. There's two kind of ways we can do a redirect. There is the redirect call, which seems kind of obvious, and then there's also the before model. And you're going to see examples of both of these. So redirect, I can just tell it to redirect somewhere, this dot transition to, whatever. When would we want to use this versus before model? We can do the same exact thing, this dot transition to whatever, right? Redirect allows all the whole model life cycle to run, and all the model life cycles of any child routes here. So it will wait for the model to be resolved. So if we're making AJAX requests, it's going to make all those requests. If it's cleaning the data, if it's setting up it's going to set up the controller, it's going to do all of that stuff. When it's done essentially setting up the page, then it redirects. Before model does it before any of that stuff happens. So before it even makes an API request, it's going to run the before model hook. So it is kind of up to you why you want to do one versus the other. For our case, we want to do before model because assumedly if they're on one of these profile pages, right, they're making a request to get account information. We don't want to just make that request if we don't have an account, so we wouldn't want to do it within the redirect here. So we want to inject our service. It was called session, and that's a service. Cool. Then in our before model hook, we want to check to see if the person's authenticated, right? So we're going to let session equals get this session. If the person is not authenticated, we want to transition them to a different page. This dot transition to, in this case, we'll just go to the rentals route. As simple as that. Because we are overriding a class function here, we want to do this dot super arguments. If you're unfamiliar with this, what this is saying is that if for whatever reason this route adopts from another route, I don't want to completely override the before model hook because its parent route might have some sort of before model hook that it adopts from. So this is saying, write all this stuff or do all this stuff, but then also do whatever it is you would normally do, what we would inherit from our parent. So in our case, we don't actually have something from our parent, but it's good to just get in the habit of that, just so that you don't run into unexpected behavior down the road. So now we have our authenticated route, right? How do I add this to the profile route? So we can actually do import authenticated, I'll call it route from the authenticated. So it's within the same exact directory, and we can pull that in. So this would be a relative path. You can also do it based on the name of the application. So this is the Super Rentals project. If we look in our environment file, we can see that's the module prefix here, Super Rentals. Then we look in the routes folder and then authenticated. I usually like importing things like this because I can import it like this anywhere, whether I'm in this directory or not. So just a little handy. So we will then extend the authenticated route. So we're no longer dealing with the default route. We are extending this route object, which already has access to session and knows to do this before model hook check for us. So let's save that and see what happens. Look at that. It automatically redirected us to rentals because we weren't logged in. So I try to go to profile, and we can see it is actually redirecting me. We don't visually see a change because the run loop's handling that for us. So if you have questions on that, check out my video about the run loop. If I log in though, and I try to go to profile, it works. The user is authenticated, and now they've logged in, right? That's actually pretty cool. So if I refresh this, it's going to log me out because it killed the session, and it's going to take me back here. Awesome. So one of the things that you have to deal with once you have this up and running is what happens if a user tries to browse directly to the profile page. Then they're redirected. I would assume that once they log in, I actually want to take them back to the page they were trying to browse to, right? This is how most applications work. If I try to go to my Amazon profile and it tells me to log in, it's not going to take me to its home page once I log in. It's going to take me back to the page I was trying to access. So this is what I would call a deferred transition. And you can track that, believe it or not, with a service. So once again, we can generate a service. Ember generate service. How many? Is that how you spell deferred? Is it 2? Deferred. 2 R's. Yeah. I'm great at spelling, as you can tell. Deferred transition. Cool. So just like our shopping cart example and our authentication example, we're going to set an object, and then we're going to get an object from this. So let me close some of these tabs because I got a lot of stuff open here, and let's go into our deferred transition. So I want to destructure again because I'm weird like that. Equals Ember. Cool. So we want to store the deferred, the transition that they want to make. So here I'm browsing to the profile page. That is a transition to the profile page. I want to store that transition object. So in Ember, it is actually a transition object. It has a bunch of functions that we can call, and one of them is retry. So that's what we're actually going to do. But we need to first store this object on our service. So this is going to be the deferred transition. Actually, I think I like attempted transition more. Then we're going to have, just like our other service, a set transition. That's going to accept a transition object. And we are going to use, we're going to end up using set and get from Ember. Set this attempted transition to the transition object that we get. Transition. And we'll have a get transition. And that will return get this transition, right? Or excuse me, attempted transition. Awesome. So attempted transition, we're going to set it, and then we're going to later get it. So let's go back to our profile route. So, or excuse me, the authenticated route. So one of the properties that actually before model accepts actually is transition. It is actually going to get the transition object passed to it. and we can then access that within this hook. So we want to import our deferred transition service. So again, if the camel case name matches the name of the service, transition, we don't have to write this out, but this is the same exact thing. So we have our transition object. Let's let deferred transition equals get this deferred transition, right? Because this function does not have access to these properties by default. So we're going to get it from this being our route object. So if the user is not authenticated, we want to defer transition. So that's our service object dot set transition, and we're going to set it to the thing that gets passed into this function, which is the transition object. Cool. So let's also log the transition object just so we can kind of take a look at that real quick. Let's refresh. Cool. If I go to the profile page, it redirects me. But here's that transition object. It has a ton of different things that we can access, has some different handlers and stuff. In terms of, let's look at these handler infos. Actually, it's probably super confusing. Either way, it's more than just like the name of the route. It has properties like whether it's active, whether it's been aborted, the sequence it falls in terms of the number of transitions that have happened so far. So now we have set this transition on our service. So we're storing that. We've redirected the person to this page. Now when they log in, I want to make them go to where they wanted to go. So let's take a look at that login function that we had. So log in the user, get this user, log in. So now that we're logging in, we need to check whether the user was actually trying to browse somewhere. So similarly, deferred transition is a service, so this also has to have access to that service, right? Now we can do, let's say let deferred transition equals get this deferred transition. Then we actually want to get the transition object. So now remember, we don't always have a transition object. The person might have been trying to browse to the normal page by default, so we might not have actually redirected them. So let's say let attempted transition equals deferred transition dot get transition, right? That's our function. And actually, let's simplify this. I'm making it a little more complicated than it needs to be. So attempted transition, we get the service, and we call the get transition function, which we declared here, which is going to return, hopefully, the transition object that we saved. So if there is an attempted transition, we're going to retry it. Cool, so that's been saved. So let's just refresh this just to be sure. Cool, so I'm going to browse to the profile page directly. It's going to load, it's going to redirect me here. Then if I log in, it logged me in and it retried that transition that we stored on our service. So that's actually pretty cool and was really pretty simple. We wrote a really simple service that only had two methods, a setter and a getter. And then any route that requires a person to be logged in, I can just have that extend this authenticated route, and it's going to handle all of that for me, right? It's going to remember where the person was trying to go, and then that login action can handle checking to see if they were attempting to go somewhere, and if so, we're going to retry. So that's kind of the intro to services in a nutshell. Again, they have long-lived state over our application. So when I set this transition object to this, or when I set something on the session, that's the same no matter where I am. And I can access that in a component. I can access that in a controller, in a route. You can actually access it in model files. You can inject services into other services. So really, really handy. Some of the services you've actually already used. The store is a service. So when you have model hooks, let's search one real quick. So this .get store. Store is actually a service. We don't inject it here because the route class by default has already done that. But if you wanted to make queries outside of the context of a route, you can actually just inject. You can do store inject service. You can do this on a component, and then you can query things from the component if you want to. It's not considered an Ember best practice, but there's definitely use cases for it. So just remember that you're using services already. You just might not realize it. So this is kind of part one of my services video. I want to go over another example. It's a little more in depth, a little more edge casey. It's going to be for an inactivity monitor. So it's going to continue on with this. I want to track how long the person's been in our application, and if they've been idle for too long, we're actually going to log them out. And then I'm actually also going to go over how we can write a test for that. So mostly it's going to be a testing tutorial. So if you found this interesting, go ahead and watch that one too. And if you like the video, give it a thumbs up or subscribe. But thanks for watching.